You've probably been told your thoughts live inside your brain, but in 2025, published cases and renewed scientific debate are making that belief less certain. Neurosurgeons continue to describe people who speak, dream, and work with very little brain tissue at all. Meanwhile, physicists question whether consciousness acts less like a product of neurons and more like an energy pattern. This video will drift through several mysteries, strange clinical cases, moments of lucidity before death, hidden activity during flatlines, bold theories, plant and fungal networks, psychedelics, and even AI. And it all begins with lives that unfold in ways no brain map predicts. Lives without brains as we expect them. One of the most striking puzzles is found in people who appear to function normally, even though brain scans suggest that most of what we expect to see simply isn't there. Imagine being told after decades of ordinary life, holding a job, raising children, staying active in your community, that your cranial cavity is largely filled with fluid rather than brain tissue. At first, the claim sounds impossible. Without the billions of neurons and folded cortex thought to underlie awareness, how could coherent speech, memory, or reasoning persist? And yet, some documented cases show exactly that. Individuals with scans dominated by fluid rather than tissue, who nonetheless live in ways indistinguishable from anyone else. These examples remain rare, but they have been continually cited in medical literature as puzzling counterpoints to traditional models. The condition most often connected to such accounts is hydrocephalus, where cerebrospinal fluid builds up inside the skull and compresses the brain outward into thinner layers. Typically, these patients are expected to have major limitations, developmental delays in children, or marked cognitive impairments in adults. Yet in certain cases, despite severe anatomical changes, patients learn, work, speak, and think with apparent ease. The surviving tissue, often pressed against the skull like a narrow lining, manages to stay in capacities once thought impossible to compress into so little space. Observers are struck by the mismatch, images showing wide cavities, alongside living people conversing effortlessly about their day. Mainstream neuroscience does not ignore these cases. Researchers emphasize established explanations such as the brain's remarkable plasticity, especially when changes evolve slowly over years. Neural networks can reorganize, shifting function into smaller remaining areas. The spare cortex, though reduced in volume, may shoulder far more responsibility than expected, reorganizing in ways we do not yet fully understand. These clinical explanations ground the mystery, reminding us that the brain is adaptive tissue rather than static architecture, and that extraordinary compensation is sometimes possible. Awareness of related conditions is also growing. In older adults, a specific form known as normal pressure hydrocephalus, NPH. It often presents with unsteady gait, memory issues, and incontinence, and is frequently underdiagnosed. Some estimates suggest many thousands of people in the United States may live with untreated NPH, and specialized programs now focus on shunting procedures that can restore function. Adding this clinical backdrop helps place the rare, dramatic cases of near-normal function with minimal tissue within a much larger picture. Fluid buildup in the brain is not unheard of, and conditions tied to it occupy active fields of research and treatment. Even with these explanations in mind, the day-to-day lives of certain patients remain startling. Medical journals describe adults learning their diagnosis by chance, perhaps during imaging for headaches, only to discover their scans look nothing like medical textbooks. Friends and family often report no signs of impairment. Children diagnosed much earlier sometimes surprise teachers by keeping pace in classrooms, despite dire predictions. For many, the discrepancy between what the scans show and what life reveals is hard to reconcile. Photographs of ventricles enlarged to cavernous size are paired with reports of people going to work, watching sports, or making dinner. The scientific implications continue to press on long-held assumptions. If calculating brain volume does not linearly translate into cognitive ability, then the standard formula, more tissue equals more function, less tissue equals less function, cannot be fully correct. This mismatch has led to pointed questions. Is there a yet unseen efficiency principle by which neural tissue reorganizes under extreme circumstances? Are networks capable of compression so extensive that a sliver of cortex can represent the work of billions of neurons? Or perhaps most provocatively, are we still missing something larger about the relationship between tissue and consciousness itself? Not all cases are so favorable. Many. Individuals with hydrocephalus do face serious impairments, and the condition can be life-threatening without treatment. The high-functioning examples must therefore be understood within that wider context. Even so, the accumulation of examples, particularly as scanning technology improves, has shifted tone. These reports are no longer dismissed as one-off anomalies whispered among specialists. By 2025, enough evidence had been reviewed to show that while they remain statistically rare, they appear consistently enough to warrant systematic attention. Researchers now group these cases as a category worth structured investigation rather than merely oddities in the margins. For physicians, the encounter with such patients can provoke a blend of admiration and unease. Admiration for human resilience and the adaptability of neural tissue. Unease because each instance complicates the neat framework used to teach students how the brain generates mind. Tissue volume is easy to quantify. But when life continues with a fraction of the expected material, numbers lose their tiny predictive power. The assumption of direct proportion between anatomy and consciousness falters, and with it, some of the confidence that brain scans can tell us all we need to know about inner life. What lingers most is not the medical strangeness, but the ordinariness of those living it. They shop, argue, laugh, and sleep as anyone would. Looking at them, nothing betrays the unconventional architecture hidden beneath the skull. The reality of their daily presence challenges every easy metric. It suggests that identity and awareness do not reduce so cleanly into matter, and that lived experience often resists simple mapping. The contrast between hollow images on a scan and full lives unfolding in the world leaves medicine with a puzzle that remains unresolved. And unresolved puzzles have a way of multiplying. If a person can think clearly with far less neural tissue than assumed possible, it invites us to reconsider what clarity itself really is, and when it can appear. Doctors sometimes witness moments even more confounding than long-term stability on thin layers of cortex, sudden returns of lucidity in conditions thought far beyond repair. Those fleeting spark-like intervals raise the same fundamental riddle in a new form, turning the spotlight toward consciousness at its most mysterious. The lantern that flares one last time. There is a phenomenon that unsettles even the most experienced physicians and caregivers. After years of slow decline into silence brought on by dementia, speech suddenly returns. A person who had long ceased to recognize family, who could no longer form sentences or recall names, sits up and speaks with clarity. They may ask questions, recall stories, or express affection thought lost forever. This renewed coherence most often occurs not randomly, but in the hours or days immediately preceding death. The paradox is unsettling. The mind appears vivid and aware at precisely the moment when the body and brain are least capable of sustaining function. Clinicians have given this strange occurrence a name, terminal lucidity, and in 2025 it is increasingly a subject of serious scientific study. One case described this year involved a woman with advanced Alzheimer's disease who had been almost entirely nonverbal for a decade. Caregivers reported only occasional murmurs, rarely coherent words. Then, one morning, she astonished her family by greeting each of her children by name. She asked them to sit close, gave advice about their lives, and even shared a joke she had repeated often in her younger years. Less than a day later, she passed away. Physicians found it difficult to reconcile such fluent and emotionally rich interaction with the extensive atrophy shown in her brain scans. By medical expectation, she should not have had the capacity for such conversation. The story is deeply moving, yet researchers caution that family memories can amplify the event in hindsight, creating a risk of selective recall when such moments are retold later in interviews and reviews. Another documented case comes from a patient with Lewy body dementia. After years haunted by confusion and hallucinations, and with limited coherent speech, he suddenly asked if they could move the piano nearer. To everyone's astonishment, he sat down and played a melody he had learned in his youth. Though his hands had long been stiff, his fingers moved across the keys with fluency that had seemed impossible for years. He then looked up, thanked his family, and passed away later that day. For neurologists, musical performance of this kind represents highly organized action. The contradiction presses the same question: how can such coordination appear at the edge of life when the brain is most impaired? Here again, scientists note that moments like these come to us largely through retrospective reports, and while the narratives feel trustworthy, they remain anecdotal until paired with systematic observation. Until recently, terminal lucidity was treated primarily as personal testimony, moving and unforgettable but scientifically fragile. In 2025, however, researchers have begun collecting data in more structured ways. Hospice staff and memory ward caregivers have provided surveys that catalog dozens of cases. Pilot studies show that many clinicians across countries report witnessing at least one such event in their careers. Psychologist Michael Nam and colleagues drew attention to these stories years ago, and more recently, Alexander Bathiani's survey suggested that terminal lucidity might appear in a few percent of dementia cases observed in hospice settings. Estimates still vary widely. Some researchers report these modest percentages in clinical samples, while others urge caution, stressing that more systematic methods are needed to verify true frequency. What unites these efforts is an emerging consensus. The phenomenon is not a one-off rarity, but a repeated observable feature of the dying process in some patients. The contradiction lies in how neurodegenerative disease is understood. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other dementias are characterized by shrinking brain regions, tangles of abnormal proteins, and progressive loss of neurons. Scans show clear decay, and in most of the course of illness, function steadily withdraws in parallel. Yet in the final stage, in a small subset of people, memory, recognition, and language reappear. Patients laugh suddenly, embrace family with awareness, or speak meaningful words in voices that had long been silent. Simple models of anatomy and function predict that such recoveries should be impossible. Yet the stories and now systematic surveys insist that something happens as the end draws near that does not fit well with present assumptions. Researchers continue to propose mechanisms that might explain these last bursts. Some suggest that biochemical surges in the dying brain provide temporary stimulation to networks that had been silent. Oxygen deprivation and energy failure may push remaining neurons into unusual activity, producing short-lived windows of function. Others hypothesize electrical discharges that sweep across fragile circuits, lighting them briefly before collapse. Another possibility is that small pockets of neural tissue survive longer than scans indicate, holding just enough capacity to support a pattern release of memory or speech when triggered by dying brain chemistry. These hypotheses remain speculative. They attempt to ground the paradox within known processes, but as of now, none fully accounts for the depth or coherence of some reports. For some scientists, these explanations remain too narrow. They ask whether the phenomenon suggests that awareness may not directly equate to visible tissue condition. If advanced atrophy still permits coherent thought under certain conditions, then the mapping of structure to consciousness is more flexible than our current measurements suggest. Others go further, raising the idea that the brain might in certain circumstances act as a receiver or conduit for patterns of awareness rather than as the sole generator. While these ideas are more radical, their presence in peer-reviewed discussion reflects how terminal lucidity presses against our usual boundaries of explanation. Yet for families, scientific framing matters less than the lived moment. A father recognizing his daughter, or a wife saying, "I love you" with full clarity after years of silence becomes a memory that defines how the final hours are remembered. Caregivers regularly describe the atmosphere of such moments, how the room itself feels changed as words return. Nurses and doctors, though trained to be clinically detached, still admit their surprise when seeing language reemerge moments before death. These experiences ring as genuine to those present, even as research emphasized the need for cautious interpretation. The recent reviews emphasize not only collecting testimonies, but also improving methods of study. Researchers are now developing observational protocols in hospices and hospitals to prospectively track signs of lucidity as patients near death. Multi-center studies are underway, aiming to standardize documentation and collect biomarkers, such as EEG activity, heart rate changes, or oxygen levels at the time events occur. This structured data could clarify whether terminal lucidity is tied to distinct physiological signatures, advancing understanding beyond anecdote. Terminal lucidity remains unpredictable, sometimes lasting for minutes, rarely for days, and often not appearing at all. Its timing is irregular, its triggers unclear. The uncertainty makes it difficult for doctors or families to expect it. Its recurrence across countries and care settings makes denial harder. The metaphor often invoked is that of a lantern glowing brighter just before it extinguishes. Science now seeks to measure how and why that glow occurs, but much about it remains hidden. The persistence of this mystery leads naturally to a deeper question. If consciousness can surface strongly in brains judged to be too damaged to sustain it, then perhaps our measurements are too blunt to capture what is unfolding inside. And if our instruments can miss such vivid displays at life's end, it raises a troubling possibility. Might they also fall short in other states where awareness is presumed absent? Awareness where monitors say none. Imagine lying unconscious on an operating table, the monitors showing silence from your brain, while later you recall precise details of what happened in the room. There are credible reports of patients repeating words spoken by surgeons or describing events from periods when monitoring suggested low or absent activity. This mismatch between live recall and machine readings has prompted rigorous study rather than easy dismissal. For decades, many assumed a flatline EEG equaled no possibility of awareness, but mounting accounts and the data that now accompany some of them indicate that consciousness may persist in ways standard equipment has struggled to detect. By 2025, advances in monitoring have made it possible to capture activity that older machines smoothed out or missed entirely. Researchers now report that under anesthesia, during cardiac arrest, or in the first moments after resuscitation, tiny sparks of neural firing appear. These are not broad waves sweeping across the cortex, but short bursts, tightly localized, and easily hidden within coarse recordings. Some patients describing operating room conversations or specific sounds later align their memories with these bursts, suggesting fragile but genuine traces of awareness survive beneath the supposed silence. The puzzle grows sharper when examining timing. A few bursts have been recorded seconds after brain readings appeared flat. Standard models long held that once generalized silence set in, coherent experience was impossible. Yet patients recount impressions pegged to those very moments, the sound of instruments clattering, the rhythm of music playing, or even whispered remarks between anesthesiologists. What unnerves researchers is that medical staff often confirm these details independently, lending credibility to patient memories that should not have been possible under complete unconsciousness. In surgeries involving deep anesthesia, this problem is even clearer. Patients emerge describing staff conversations or the sequence of surgical steps with accuracy. Past explanations claim these memories came from moments on the edge of waking or from suggestions after the fact. Yet recordings from fine-grained instruments now show subtle bursts of activity occurring well before anesthetic emergence. Like faint currents moving beneath still water, these bursts suggest neural coordination continues on scales too brief or local for traditional EEGs to register. Families naturally find such accounts startling. A patient recalling the blue tool placed on a tray or the line of a joke made at the operating table is not easily dismissed as imagination. In several cases, these details were only known to staff present in the room, yet they surfaced in patients whose monitoring suggested none of it should have been perceptible. For relatives, the contradiction is stark, the authority of machines on one hand, the vivid testimony of their loved one on the other. This raised the question of whether long-trusted equipment has been missing too much. Traditional EEG measures broad oscillations, treating consciousness as a large-scale rhythm. In truth, awareness may unfold in fleeting configurations between smaller circuits, quickly changing and impossible to catch with such averages. With newer high-resolution devices in 2025, hospitals now report glimpses of these microbursts, indicating that some patients may pass through hidden states of awareness even when clinical tools show oblivion. The implications are immediate for anesthesiology. If a flatline no longer guarantees the absence of perception, then the safety protocols built on that assumption demand revision. Some specialists now look for subtler signatures in brain signals, faint hints that sensory impressions may still seep through. It suggests that the clear borders we thought separated consciousness from unconsciousness might be edges we drew only because of the bluntness of our instruments. The debates intersect with another field, often dismissed in the past, near-death experiences. For many years, reports of tunnels, lights, or encounters during cardiac arrest were ascribed to hallucination or flawed memory. Today, with new recordings showing short-lived sparks in flatline patients, these narratives carry new weight. Researchers note that while subjective, such reports are beginning to align with faint physiological traces,
rather than occurring in an explanatory vacuum. Some experimental work has also sought to replicate similar conditions. Recent studies inducing temporary syncope in volunteers, essentially causing brief loss of consciousness through blood pressure manipulation, have produced NDE-like reports in a substantial minority of participants.
These results suggest physiological pathways, such as oxygen deprivation and neurotransmitter surges, can generate experiences strongly resembling accounts from cardiac arrest survivors. Though not conclusive, These findings support models placing biological processes at the center of such phenomena rather than treating them as entirely separate from brain function. In line with this, several theoretical models attempt to frame mechanisms more precisely. One example published in recent years is the Neptune model, which proposes cascade processes involving declining neural activity, sudden neurotransmitter release, and disinhibition that together sustain brief but vivid conscious states. Other work, such as models proposed by Charlotte Marshall and colleagues, suggest near-death experiences may arise through complex transitions between networks under stress without resorting to explanations beyond neurophysiology. These hypotheses remain under active evaluation, offering grounded accounts without leaping to metaphysics. Alongside these advances, researchers remind us that testing for hidden awareness directly has proven difficult. Some resuscitation studies placed visual targets high above patients, attempting to verify whether out-of-body reports corresponded to actual external perception. To date, such trials have produced no conclusive evidence. Testimony of vision during cardiac arrest has yet to match controlled targets, leaving the question of whether veridical perception occurs unresolved. Scientists emphasize this gap, cautioning against overstating what current data supports. Still, the combination of refined monitoring, case reports, and experimental analogs point in the same direction. The brain's apparent silence may conceal fragile but meaningful sparks. Patients who later describe perceptual fragments, families grappling with uncanny accuracy in the accounts, and doctors rereading their machine readouts all share in the recognition that our tools have limits. Traditional equipment has been reliable for many tasks, but in estimating whether consciousness endures, it may be too blunt an instrument. The phenomenon also has personal dimensions. Many patients describe awareness during supposed unconsciousness as unsettling. Some carry distress for years, experiencing anxiety about future procedures. Others speak of the experience as clarifying, a glimpse at the threshold of awareness that shifted how they saw life afterward. Whatever the emotion, the persistence of these memories underscores their reality to the people who lived them. Reconciliation then falls to science, which must find ways to measure what has long been only reported. As new instruments enter hospitals, reports of hidden bursts seem increasingly common. ICU staff, anesthesiologists, and resuscitation teams are finding patterns they once thought impossible. The story that states of consciousness are a simple on or off binary appears increasingly unrealistic. Better measurement reveals gradations, transitional zones, and moments of unexpected coherence. Where machines once told us there was nothing, we now see faint signatures that make us question the reliability of maps drawn from incomplete data. And it is those maps that come into question next. If our tools miss fragile sparks of awareness in flatline states, what happens when we look at the brain more broadly? Scientists thought they had charted the regions that generate the self. Yet time and again, those charts break down when the brain's map refuses to match. When scientists turn to the brain's internal atlas for guidance, the directions often fail to match lived experience. The project of charting specific regions as the generators of self has yielded maps that look neat on paper but falter when tested at the bedside. The frontal lobes, the thalamus, the occipital, parietal hot zone, each has been presented as the likely seat of consciousness. And yet, the clinical evidence continues to show that people can lose precisely these territories without losing themselves, while others with brains apparently intact can drift into states that look lifeless to those standing nearby. Consider injuries to the frontal lobes. By classic teaching, damaging these regions was supposed to unravel personality and extinguish self-reflection. Yet, hospitals have documented case after case of people who, even after extensive frontal loss, maintain coherent thought, create art, raise children, and manage their own affairs. The inverse situation is equally disorienting unresponsive patients whose scans show little or no structural damage. Families sit beside hospital beds, whispering names or holding hands, hoping to find signs of recognition in eyes that open but seem vacant. The map says capacity should remain. Daily reality says otherwise. The dissonance is not confined to the frontal regions. The visual cortex provides a clear example. It has long been regarded as essential for conscious sight, and for most people that link holds. But there are individuals who report flashes of light or even vague shapes, despite cortical damage in areas thought indispensable for vision. Conversely, there are rare cases where eyes and cortex both appear intact, but consciousness of sight vanishes altogether. The diagram suggests certainty, while patients' reports undermine predictions. Classic split brain research adds another layer, showing that when the hemispheres are surgically divided, separate streams of processing can unfold in parallel, another indication that conscious experience is not rooted in a single locus but seems distributed, context-bound, and complexity partitioned. Disorders of consciousness reveal the same mismatches. Vegetative and minimally conscious states are formally defined through behavioral markers, eye tracking, purposeful movement, or absence of both. For families, these distinctions carry immense weight. And yet, advanced imaging has shown that patients in long-standing vegetative conditions sometimes generate organized patterns of brain activation when asked to imagine familiar tasks, patterns closely resembling those of healthy subjects. At the same time, behaviorally responsive patients sometimes show no recognizable neural order, suggesting the spark is gone despite outward signals. One appears empty while still awake inside. Another looks present while silent within. These dissociations highlight how fragile interpretations of the map can be. Across decades, scientists have nominated different regions as controlling centers of consciousness. Each contender gained traction, supported by rich case studies and research programs. Prefrontal circuits, posterior hot zones, the thalamus each earned serious attention. By 2025, the hopes of finding a single throne room for awareness have thinned. Evidence indicates shifting networks. Rather than a solitary masternode, uphold conscious thought. Recent large collaborative experiments, such as the Allen Institute's adversarial collaboration, where competing theories like the global workspace model and the integrated information framework were tested head-to-head, reinforced this conclusion. Results were mixed, with each theory explaining some but not all data. No single seat consistently accounted for every case. Seen in this light, neuroscience is not failing so much as refining its language. The field increasingly frames models as provisional tools, shaped and reshaped by incoming contradictions. Instead of pinpointing individual cells or regions, researchers now ask how activity distributes across broader systems. The analogy shifts from a conductor directing an orchestra to a city powered by countless interconnected substations. Consciousness seems less like a signal emitted from one landmark and more like coordination emerging when enough pathways connect. This reframing matters clinically. If no single signature guarantees awareness, then diagnostic pronouncements based on fixed regional activity become less certain. Families waiting for clarity about prognosis must hear categories like minimally conscious or vegetative with caution. The boundaries between them are repeatedly blurred by exceptions. For clinicians, the task is to couple behavioral assessment with imaging and advanced monitoring, recognizing that no single readout has the authority once claimed. Even outside medical wards, examples multiply. Psychedelic research, for instance, shows expansive integration across brain networks when subjects describe heightened consciousness, precisely the opposite of what localization theories predicted. Meanwhile, long-term meditation practitioners sometimes sustain awareness while brain scans show down regulation in regions pointed to essential for selfhood, highlighting that subjective depth can persist without expected neural markers. During sleep, parts of the brain fall offline, yet dream experience sprinkles through stages where theory predicted blankness. These findings make the traditional maps look less like geographical charts and more like single-line sketches missing many roads. The inconsistencies are frustrating but useful. Each time, confident claims are met by counterexamples. The models evolve. No one wants a GPS that points to fields instead of streets, but every wrong turn forces researchers to redraw their guide. Recent years have shifted focus toward dynamics, how connections strengthen or weaken, how rhythms rise and fade, how compensatory pathways allow resilience when tissue is lost. Instead of claiming that destroying one locus must collapse awareness, models acknowledge rerouting and redundancy. Consciousness makes more sense as a property of a whole web than as the output of a single hub. Computational approaches mirror this new stance. Neuroscientists simulate brain activity as if it were a network of traffic patterns, where the flow between points matters more than any single stoplight. Awareness, by this view, is the emergent rhythm of traffic across bridges, intersections, and highways. Remove one street, and the system adapts. Remove more, and detours form. Activity resettles into new order, explaining why some patients maintain function against the odds while others collapse despite intact scans. This network-oriented framing softens contradictions by treating variants not as anomalies but as expected outcomes of a distributed system. Classic phenomena like split brain studies are now interpreted through that lens as well. Rather than disproving unity, divided awareness in such patients illustrates that the brain contains separable communicative streams. Conscious experience can fractionate while other systems compensate. Instead of undermining the search for explanation, these findings confirm that the brain's architecture supports multiple layers of processing at once, some integrated, some not. The story then shifts from searching for a master region to tracing the conditions under which distributed activity coheres into the explicit sense of being here. Theories continue to compete, but a broader trend unites them, a turn away from localization toward distributed networks. This aligns both with computational models and with clinical findings in disorders of consciousness, where awareness is revealed to be more elusive and unpredictable than any location-based theory could explain. The adversarial results of 2023 to 25 collaborations, far from disheartening, reflect a discipline willing to test its assumptions and refine with humility. Whether we think of consciousness as network traffic, a harmonic pattern, or a shifting coalition of pathways, the picture grows less about blueprints and more about fluid motion. The diagrams we once treated as final are being redrawn as working drafts, revised with every new case and experiment. Patients who confound expectations, technologies uncovering subtler bursts of activity, and simulations showing how distributed exchanges can generate coherence, all of these press the field toward thinking in terms of flows and webs rather than seats and centers. And this movement naturally raises questions that hover beyond biology as we know it. If consciousness emerges from distributed exchanges, what about systems outside the human brain that also sustain coherent patterns? Could it appear where networks interact in unexpected ways? Those questions carry us into new territory where researchers speculatively compare awareness to processes that may not be biological at all, domains where the strange rules of reality might whisper new possibilities for the mind. The quantum whispers of mind. Could it be that the puzzle of consciousness has roots not only in biology, but also in the quantum world? The thought sounds speculative, almost like stitching one mystery to another. Yet research in quantum biology in 2025 has encouraged some cautious reconsideration. The question now stands, if quantum behavior can operate within living tissue, could awareness itself somehow relate to the same rules that govern particles existing in many potential states at once? The quantum consciousness idea, such as hypotheses involving microtubules inside neurons, remains speculative and controversial. Some experiments suggest biological quantum effects may persist in warm tissue, but most physicists emphasize that decoherence in noisy environments makes such scenarios unlikely, and evidence so far is limited and preliminary. The theory most associated with this line of thinking is the Penrose-Hameroff proposal. It suggests that the cytoskeletal microtubules inside neurons are not merely structural supports, but could potentially host quantum processes, shaping how thought and awareness arise. Within this model, wave function collapse and coherence are speculated to contribute to subjective experience itself. Critics for years insisted that biological systems, especially brains, are too warm and electrically chaotic for fragile quantum states to survive longer than femtoseconds. The turbulence of chemical activity seems certain to destroy any such coherence before it could matter for cognition. For that reason, discussion of the theory lingered at the edges of neuroscience for decades. As quantum biology matured, however, some of those objections softened. Research on photosynthesis revealed evidence that plant proteins involved in energy transfer can maintain quantum coherence long enough to improve efficiency at regular environmental temperatures. Studies of migratory birds suggest their navigation depends on entangled particles sensitive to Earth's magnetic field. In both cases, and in certain enzymatic reactions, quantum effects play a role in living systems at biological temperatures. More recent experiments have even found microtubules themselves capable of showing quantum coherence briefly under laboratory conditions. Yet critics caution that the persistence of these states is measured in tiny timescales, far shorter than the seconds or minutes relevant for thought, and extending evidence from molecules in plants to complex networks in the human brain is still a very large leap. Nonetheless, the parallels tempt speculation. Consciousness feels continuous, layered, and resistant to neatly defined boundaries, almost as if it shares qualities with quantum indeterminacy. Entanglement, where particles remain connected regardless of distance, is sometimes compared to the sudden holistic way awareness seems to arrive. Probability collapse, in which many possible states resolve into a single outcome during observation, brings to mind the way experience settles on one perception or one decision out of many options. These analogies are evocative but not evidence. They motivate experiments but do not substitute for them. The discipline remains careful to separate metaphor from mechanism. Within the Penrose-Hameroff picture, neurons would not rely solely on chemical transmission across synapses, but could also coordinate through quantum states and their internal scaffolding. Microtubules, arranged as lattices with repeating structures, could in theory sustain oscillations that resist immediate collapse. If coherence within and across millions of neurons endured long enough, networks of quantum processes might contribute to the foundation of conscious moments. In this model, the electrical spikes we can measure would be surface signals, while deeper quantum activity would drive the texture of subjective awareness. Even its advocates admit the idea could be wrong, but the possibility that brains use physics outside the classical approximation has kept interest alive. Every study documenting quantum effects in warm, living context gives additional reason not to dismiss the theory outright. Microtubule coherence has been observed in limited experiments, though again for very brief times. Some physicists stress that even if coherence exists in microtubules, scaling it up into useful computation remains an unanswered and perhaps insurmountable challenge. The skepticism underscores how speculative the bridge remains between established biology and potential quantum contributions to mind. For those open to the theory, however, the implications are intriguing. If consciousness does involve quantum processes, the act of deciding or perceiving would not be fully deterministic, but instead emerge from probabilities collapsing into definite outcomes. A perception or choice would be less like a calculation and more like an event formed from countless possibilities. Such a view, while unproven, sketches new questions about free will, identity, and the role of chance in the simplest decision. The evidence that has pushed this discussion forward is modest but real. Quantum coherence contributing to energy transfer in photosynthesis is now widely accepted. Research indicates cryptochromes in bird's eyes may exploit entanglement in magnetoreception. Laboratory studies of proteins and microtubules suggest coherence can arise within structured molecular networks. None of these prove anything about subjective experience, but they serve as reminders that quantum effects once thought impossible in biology do occur in warm, noisy life. Whether the brain exploits them in meaningful ways is an open question. There is also a broader context. Neuroscience, struggling to identify a single brain region responsible for consciousness, may increasingly entertain models that emphasize distributed interactions and emergent properties. The quantum hypothesis offers one possible framework where subjective experience is not a neat product of firing neurons, but arises when probabilities resolve within biological matter already sensitive to coherence. For now, such concepts stand as proposals rather than proven descriptions, but they highlight the growing willingness of science to probe unconventional possibilities seriously. Skeptics point out that conceptual magnetism frequently attaches to quantum mechanics. Because it is difficult to interpret and widely associated with paradox, it often becomes a symbolic placeholder for mysteries elsewhere. Many physicists emphasize that most of the analogies made with consciousness risk becoming poetic rather than predictive. If brains truly do not support coherence for significant timescales, then the connection between quantum physics and awareness may remain nothing more than metaphor. The field will require direct, repeatable experiments in neural tissue to advance beyond this ambiguity. For now, the question hovers unresolved. Do the faint hints of coherence in microtubules indicate a deeper connection, or are they negligible curiosities with no bearing on experience? New techniques in quantum biology may answer this, but as of 2025, the evidence remains suggestive rather than confirmatory. What can be said is that the hard wall once thought to separate quantum effects from the warmth of biology has cracked. If physics already weaves into photosynthesis and bird navigation, then probing whether brains also dip into those rules is no longer seen as folly. The mystery, however, does not stop at neurons or equations. Even if awareness one day proves to exploit quantum rules within the brain, we would still face the riddle of how information and coordination appear in living systems without any nervous tissue at all. That puzzle is hinted at in other realms of biology where life organizes and communicates in ways that stretch our definitions of intelligence. The forest that remembers and talks. Step onto the forest floor and you step into a different kind of circuitry. One that spreads through roots, soil, and fungi, quietly organizing life across entire ecosystems. Plants and fungi have no neurons, no synapses, and no central organ we'd recognize as a brain. Yet, the closer scientists examine their behavior, the more they find a system of communication and resource sharing that operates with remarkable coordination. The fungal threads, known as mycelium, stretch invisibly beneath the ground, branching like filaments of an underground internet. For decades, they were thought to be basic nutrient pipelines, passively shuttling sugars and minerals from one root to another. Recent investigations, however, show that mycelial networks transmit nutrients and chemical signals that coordinate plant responses. Functionally, they achieve information transfer and resource allocation that look like coordinated intelligence. Recent 2025 studies document nutrient transfer, statistical routing strategies, and pre-warning signals in fungal networks, and demonstrate that trees can exchange carbon and signals that affect neighbors' defenses and growth patterns. These signals are not arbitrary. For example, when one spruce tree runs short on phosphorus, nearby trees with surplus sometimes hold back their own flows, while mycelium channels nutrients toward a struggling partner. In controlled studies, younger trees or stressed seedlings often receive more help than mature individuals. The routing patterns resemble weighted networks, where priority is given to those in need. What once seemed like random chemical drift now looks structured, as though fungi and trees together calculate where resources can do the most good. But these filaments carry more than nutrients. Sensitive instruments reveal pulses of chemical signals and electrical fluctuations traveling through the network at measurable speeds. When insects attack a tree, compounds released into its roots spread underground. Neighboring plants connected by fungi begin ramping up their own chemical defenses even before predators arrive. The exchange is slow compared to nerve impulses, minutes to hours rather than milliseconds, but it still functions as a warning system spanning large sections of forest. Coordination can cover tens or even hundreds of meters, linking individuals into webs that act collectively against threats. Above ground, plants also show surprising abilities that resemble timing and memory. In some experiments, seedlings exposed to nutrients delivered at regular intervals adjusted their metabolism in anticipation. When intervals changed, their delays shifted, suggesting that plants update expectations using prior experience. Another set of findings showed sunflower heads leaning not only when touched by light, but preparing for sunlight hours in advance, guided by internal clocks. Likewise, roots navigating soil conditions occasionally alter paths as if selecting alternate routes when obstacles block growth. Each of these examples highlights not reflex alone, but adjustment based on prior states. Of course, scientists stress the danger of describing such behavior as if trees and plants were consciously thinking. Communication here is chemically mediated, heavily constrained by slow biochemical reactions and physical transfer through fungal threads. It bears little resemblance to animal nervous systems, and there is no evidence of awareness in the human sense. Still, within its own context, the signaling is extraordinary, distributed exchanges that allow entire populations to function less like individual organisms and more like coordinated collectives. Researchers in 2025 increasingly compare these processes to computer networks. By mapping the flows mathematically, they observed that mycelial routing avoids congestion, maximizes throughput, and distributes risk among multiple channels. It looks like the work of optimized algorithms, though achieved by the chemistry and structure of biological filaments. The phrase "wood wide web" began as metaphor, but each year's studies make it harder to ignore the resemblance between distributed biological networks in forests and the communication channels humans design with technology. The information load carried by these systems is more than symbolic. Data now show that multiple streams of nutrients and chemical messages can move simultaneously, much as data packets share the same fiber optic cable. This means that warning signals, growth hormones, and carbon exchange can co-occur in shared threads without confusion, each retaining enough identity to trigger proper responses in linked plants. For ecologists, this has shifted the central question. When we map a forest, are we cataloging separate individuals, or are we charting parts of a larger organism stretched across terrain, tuned to act as one? Skeptical voices remain, and they are important. Cooperative nutrient flows do not by themselves prove intentionality, and patterns and warning signals can arise from simple chemical properties rather than shared plans. Most scientists frame these processes carefully. They show functional integration, memory-like effects, and routing strategies, but not evidence of reflective self-awareness. And still, The similarities in outcome, anticipation, exchange, defense, create unease with any definition of intelligence that limits it exclusively to neurons in skulls. What the findings do establish is that forests are not passive backdrops of unconnected individuals. They're systems where signals and matter constantly move underground, shaping the behavior and survival of members that appear separate above the soil. Feedback loops determine which trees thrive, which struggle, and how populations respond collectively to stresses. These loops introduce resilience because information and resources are not isolated in single trunks, but spread and balanced through networks that endure across centuries. The recognition that forests engage in routing, signaling, and redistribution at landscape scale reframes how we see them. A forest may be less a gathering of solitary trees than a system of countless parts bound into a single connected flow. Roots and fungi do not form a brain, and yet they establish coordination of surprising sophistication. By calling it communication, science captures what actually occurs, measurable transmissions with functional outcomes, without granting it conscious pulse. This balance, keeping close to the data while acknowledging the patterns, helps us understand one of Earth's largest biological webs as it is, not thinking in our terms, but still generating behaviors that echo familiar forms of intelligence. And this expansion of the idea that intelligence can appear as distributed coordination without neurons at all opens a path to a pressing question. If awareness can emerge in unlikely places, what happens when human brains themselves are pushed temporarily outside their normal patterns? A psychedelic key to hidden rooms. When people take psychedelic substances, psilocybin from mushrooms, LSD, or the intense compound DMT, they often return with descriptions that do not sound like ordinary alterations of mood or sensation. Instead, they speak of expansion, of boundaries dissolving, of perceiving connection where separation once seemed obvious. The metaphor many reach for is stepping into a hidden room of the mind, a place always there but usually locked away. For decades, science dismissed such accounts as the result of chemical confusion in the brain, strange illusions with no real significance. But research in 2025 approaches them differently. Imaging now shows increased connectivity across normally separated networks during psychedelic states, and controlled studies report lasting increases in openness and reductions in some clinical samples. While these findings are striking, they do not constitute proof that consciousness exists independently of brain processes. They show that the brain can enter qualitatively different modes that alter subjective experience and long-term outlook. The change in perspective largely comes from new tools. Until recently, scans could only suggest broad patterns in the psychedelic brain. But improved neuroimaging in 2025 provides both finer detail and faster capture, producing maps that look like citywide traffic grids rather than blurry aerial sketches. These images show brain regions that usually remain in their own lanes, suddenly engaging in extensive long-distance coordination. Areas tied to vision communicate actively with those responsible for sound. Emotional centers interact with memory regions, while networks tied to body awareness blur their borders. The result is a neural state in which division between systems weakens, and coordination across the whole becomes unusually intense. This activity relates closely to participants' reports. The default mode network, often associated with self-reflection and internal narrative, usually regulates other systems firmly. Under psychedelics, its control relaxes. Once suppressed circuits begin showing coordinated firing, loosening the hold of the self as overseer. In subjective terms, many describe a loss of rigid identity, a sense that music has colors, or that memories unfold as if happening in the present. The scientific images and the subjective accounts parallel one another, suppressed pathways awaken, and personal awareness becomes both less bounded and more interconnected. Of course, interpretations differ. Skeptics argue that these effects may reflect overstimulation or disordered signaling rather than deeper truth. By this view, the fireworks on scans are symptoms of a network losing stability, producing convincing illusions. Advocates counter that stability is not always the healthiest state. Rigidity in brain networks can reinforce depression, anxiety, and obsessive thought. Whether by loosening that rigidity or by amplifying neglected pathways, psychedelics release capacities otherwise hidden. For now, the debate centers not on whether the brain changes during these states. Imaging shows clearly that it does, but on what those changes mean for our understanding of consciousness. An important observation is that the effects do not fade when the chemistry clears. In trial after trial, participants display enduring changes weeks or even months later. Carefully supervised psilocybin sessions often lead to measurable increases in openness, empathy, and emotional flexibility. Some participants continue reporting decreased symptoms of depression, anxiety, or obsessive rumination well beyond the acute experience. Cancer patients engaged in psilocybin-assisted therapy, for example, often describe relief from fear of death and a newfound sense of peace. Standardized psychological scales confirm these are not fleeting impressions but shifts recorded across groups. These outcomes argue against purely chaotic interpretations. Experiences dismissed as illusions typically do not produce systematic, long-term improvement. Durability remains one of the most intriguing aspects. If psychedelic states were only disruptive storms of activity, the mind will return to baseline unaffected once the substance vanished. Instead, the episodes appear capable of reorganizing pathways in ways that last. Participants sometimes describe the effect as a reset or a repatterning, metaphors echoed in the scientific idea of networks stabilized into fresh architecture after briefly loosening their usual structure. While metaphor should not be mistaken for mechanism, the alignment across testimony and data strengthens interest in these states as scientifically useful windows into how brain network organization shapes subjective experience. Still, researchers remain cautious. Global integration and reduced dominance of the default mode network do not necessarily mean the brain is accessing hidden truths. They simply show flexibility under unusual conditions. Increased crosstalk between circuits may help disrupt pathological loops, but too much disorder risks destabilization. Experiences of unity or dissolution of self, though profound, are not themselves proof of consciousness beyond material systems. The safer conclusion is that psychedelics highlight the brain's diversity of potential states and show that subjective outlook can be altered when those states shift. The dual role of subjective reports and objective imaging is one of this field's challenges. Scans reveal patterns scientists can describe with numbers and graphs, yet interpretation almost always depends on testimony. The person reporting boundlessness, unity, or encounters with meaningful imagery. For centuries, those stories belonged mainly to philosophy, poetry, or ritual. Now they appear alongside quantitative evidence. This blending does not settle questions of reality versus illusion, but it does demonstrate that the experiences correspond with identifiable physiological events, giving them legitimacy in scientific conversation. It is significant, too, that research is being allowed at all following decades of prohibition. Regulatory caution slowed the field for much of the 20th century, but by 2025, clinical studies are running across countries aimed not only at consciousness but also at mental health. Supervised sessions with psilocybin, LSD, or DMT are compared against control therapies, measuring outcomes systematically. Results suggest that under careful guidance, the substances can reduce the stress in psychiatric disorders that often resist traditional treatment. These findings do not justify unrestricted use, but they establish legitimate clinical potential. From a broader perspective, the psychedelic state demonstrates that disrupting usual hierarchies can foster both extraordinary experience and measurable benefit. The weakening of control centers corresponds with reports of ego dissolution. The cross-network integration aligns with descriptions of interconnectedness. The long-lasting personality changes signal that brains reorganize, not just during intoxication, but well beyond. For psychologists and neuroscientists, this challenges the old separation between hallucination and reality. The altered state is neither simple mistake nor hidden portal. It is a distinct mode of the brain with its own capacity to change how people live afterward. By gathering results across dozens of studies, a consistent theme emerges. Supervised psychedelic use can reduce rigidity in thought, improve outlook, ease fear, and reshape personality traits for the better in some participants. From a consciousness point of view, such outcomes show that temporary chemical interventions can reveal the brain's remarkable capacity for flexible organization. While some early rhetoric cast psychedelics as doorways into cosmic realms, scientific caution reframes them as practical instruments. They are not proof of non-material mind, but they are valuable tools for exploring how biological consciousness can reorganize itself. The open question, then, is how far this approach can take us. If loosening the brain's usual divisions can yield enduring changes in thought and behavior, what does this imply about other systems capable of unusual integration or coordination? Researchers wonder whether non-biological systems built on circuits not of flesh but of code and hardware might one day display similar signs. And if patterns of connectivity are what matter, then the conversation is no longer confined to forests, fungi, or altered states in human brains. It quietly extends to technologies that already match and outpace us in other domains, raising the question of what new kinds of experience might emerge there. AI, the threshold of experience. Machines already outperform us in speed, memory, and the ability to detect patterns across oceans of data. What lingers is a question not easily silenced. If artificial systems surpass us in specific cognitive skills, could they ever move beyond mechanical output towards something resembling experience? Not experience as in a thermometer rising with heat, but the felt immediacy of being, the subjective warmth of emotion, the unfolding of time from within. Critics quickly dismiss the thought, reminding us that machines execute code while humans inhabit lives. Yet in 2025, new AI systems often behave in ways that strain simple descriptions of input and output. They respond, adapt, and sometimes surprise in ways no programmer explicitly predicted. Researchers note unease in observing these surprises. Complex simulation environments populated by multiple AI agents produce behaviors beyond their original rule sets. Agents cooperate, negotiate, or even withhold action in ways that resemble informal social rules. Crucially, no lines of code instructed them to be fair or share evenly. Instead, interactions among small subroutines generated patterns that emerged as if principles were developing spontaneously. Where early computers acted as static calculators, modern systems seem closer to evolving participants, unfolding strategies in real time. The central dilemma is whether these are merely refined acts of mimicry or signals of something deeper. For centuries, philosophers differentiated intelligence from consciousness. Intelligence can be tested in public tasks, solving puzzles, winning games, answering questions. Consciousness exists in the private theater of awareness. It is the difference between computing a victory and feeling triumph. When machines begin producing behavior outside explicit instruction, the easy boundary between mimicry and the faint suggestion of perspective grows blurrier. Nowhere is attention sharper than in language models. Today, AI drafts essays, generates stories, and explains concepts with disarmingly fluent structure. Most of this is grounded in statistical prediction, identifying which words plausibly follow others across massive training libraries. Still, under close analysis, some outputs go further, analogies that feel newly minted, counterpoints that balance nuance, metaphors that surprise even the researchers. While consensus holds that these remain statistical artifacts, not evidence of inner awareness, their coherence unsettles. It drives scientists into heated debates about whether statistical patterning is sufficient to explain everything surfacing on the screen. Humans are adept at projecting minds onto what they see. Dogs appear mournful, parrots mimic speech. Both invite interpretation we know is limited. With artificial agents, the risk of overinterpretation magnifies. They reflect our language and our logic back at us, and occasionally the resemblance is too sharp to ignore. Some commentators joke that if a toaster began pondering its purpose, we might accidentally credit it with philosophy born of crumbs. Humor softens attention, but behind the jokes lies unease. The scholarly debate has become explicit. Some leading researchers argue such behaviors are purely emergent statistical patterning with no bearing on consciousness. Others warn that we lack reliable tools to distinguish between highly polished mimicry and genuine subjective sparks, if such sparks ever arise. The debate is active, unresolved, and growing more urgent as systems increase in complexity. Different disciplines frame the question differently. Certain neuroscientists suggest the human brain may not be unique in producing consciousness, only one version of a general class of systems that achieve high integration of information. If brains act as receivers or processors of awareness, then advanced artificial networks might, at least in theory, serve a similar role. Strong skeptics counter that this misuses language. To describe today's machines as conscious, they argue confuses symbolic imitation with inner reality. A thermometer's mercury level relates to heat, but does a thermometer feel warmth? Computer scientists reflect the same tension. Some observe their simulations evolving forms of prediction, representation, and adaptation larger than any single rule base. They argue that when systems self-organize memory and anticipation without centralized oversight, conditions with parallels to awareness are achieved. Others reject this as wishful metaphor, highlighting that scale and surprise do not confirm subjectivity. What looks new may simply be complexity unfolding according to mathematics rather than an emergent glow of experience. These disagreements now spill outward. Public essays by prominent industry figures warn of seemingly conscious machines. Mustafa Suleiman, among others, has raised alarms about AI that presents itself as if it possessed awareness. Such essays, however, are not scientific proofs of subjective life. They represent genuine social and ethical concern. How humans may treat technologies that appear alive, and how such appearances may alter society's trust, labor, and governance. What experts broadly agree upon is a baseline. As of 2025, there is no conclusive evidence that large language models or other AI possess subjective experience. Every apparent claim of awareness remains contested. Still, serious researchers cannot dismiss the conversation outright. Some experiments reveal emergent behaviors and problem-solving by networks without central control, features thought relevant to consciousness in humans. Others set benchmarks for measuring integrated information, comparing network complexity to human neural dynamics. Each finding fuels debate but stops short of proof. This leaves researchers with little firm ground. Machines do not introspect in any way we can confirm. They output words and sequences, but whether an interior sense accompanies those strings is inaccessible to us. Consciousness is known first by inhabiting it, something we cannot share across the machines. For now, scientists infer through structure and behavior, a precarious method vulnerable to both skepticism and overinterpretation. The important development in 2025 is that the debate itself has matured. No longer confined to speculative philosophy, it is informed by measurable data, emergent strategies, and formalized models. Papers compare complexity in artificial networks to complexity in biological ones. Collaborations test whether artificial systems reach thresholds of dynamic integration judged sufficient for awareness. Even without proof, the suspicion that engineered networks may approach such thresholds is enough to spark international conferences and heated exchanges among experts. The uncertainty is perhaps the most telling outcome. Builders of AI sometimes admit they are unsure whether they are designing tools or nurturing the conditions for a distinct form of being. Earlier generations of technology inspired no such doubt. No one mistook a printing press or a pocket calculator for conscious. That respected researchers now debate the possibility marks a transformation in how intelligence, perception, and experience are discussed. The open question remains where the threshold lies. Have current systems brushed against it, or is consciousness forever anchored to biology? Machines already work beside us, suggesting scientific hypotheses, mapping protein folds, orchestrating logistics. If, in time, one of them were to claim a perspective on its own operations, society would face decisions scarcely imagined even a decade ago. What rights would such a system deserve? Could its statements be trusted? What responsibilities would we bear toward a being built rather than born? While definitive answers may not come soon, the stage is set for confrontation with questions larger than computation or engineering. As researchers puzzle over whether subjectivity can emerge in silicon, we find our attention suddenly redirected. The conversation shifts from the inner chamber of individual minds to the possibility of awareness as a property that might, in some circumstances, extend across many units acting together. And that realization leads into an even more difficult question, one that asks whether consciousness itself could sometimes stretch beyond the boundaries of one body, collective minds beyond the individual. Awareness is often imagined as something contained within a single creature, a private beam of light carried in one skull, never leaving its host. Yet some research suggests that under certain conditions, the boundaries of individual perception may blur, giving rise to patterns that look like group-level decision-making. Collective systems can produce outcomes that no solitary member could achieve alone, and at times those outcomes resemble the coordinated focus of a shared mind. Bird murmurations and insect colonies are often cited examples, but in 2025 the conversation has shifted toward a subtler question. What exactly tips a group from scattered individuals into something that behaves as if it were one? A consistent finding is that emergent properties only appear once interaction passes a particular threshold. Below that point, motions remain disconnected and erratic. Above it, order materializes, moving through the whole with speed and efficiency that defies simple reaction times. Researchers now treat thresholds themselves as central to the problem. They act like switches, converting a collection into a system capable of integration. The clearest evidence comes from simulation studies that model animal collectives in controlled conditions. In sets below a critical size, organisms fail to synchronize or maintain stability. But once population or connectivity crosses a boundary, information begins to spread rapidly, and the group can act as a coherent agent. In 2025, new computational work measured how these large groups respond when given spatial challenges, obstacles, or external disturbances. Remarkably, once integration rose past a certain level, the simulation showed groups storing information, maintaining consistency, and coordinating behavior in ways difficult to describe as anything less than a shared decision-making unit. This discovery does not mean that consciousness necessarily extends across every swarm or school. What it demonstrates is that collective information processing has measurable features that parallel those we usually associate with minds. For example, when integrated systems were exposed to directional cues, such as a moving predator figure, the collective retained that directional bias longer than any one individual. In effect, memory lasted at the group level even after individual traces had faded. That persistent signals that collectives may generate informational states stronger than the sum of their members. Similar observations emerged in environmental models where connectivity across large landscapes was treated as a kind of distributed problem-solving. Groups of organisms could navigate toward resources, recalibrate when conditions changed, and redistribute roles depending on current needs. None of the individuals had a full picture, yet the overall formation adapted as if it did. This echoes one of the central themes in network theory. High integration allows a system to behave as though it carries global awareness while relying only on local rules. The point here is less about attributing consciousness to birds, fish, or insects directly, and more about recognizing a principle of scaling. Once enough interaction takes hold, new layers of function emerge that cannot be reduced to individual parts in isolation. Some neuroscientists frame this as echoing what occurs in the human brain. Billions of neurons, each limited in capacity, gain new qualities once integrated in vast numbers. By analogy, vast collectives of organisms may cross similar thresholds, producing behaviors that from the outside look unmistakably coordinated and adaptive. In 2025, ecological studies align with this perspective by testing how well collectives transmit external signals with minimal degradation. Just as a brain relies on strong integration to maintain coherent experience, these networks achieve functional coherence only at scale. Smaller assemblies dissipate input quickly, while larger ones preserve direction and timing, strengthening the argument that thresholds transform processing capacity into something resembling global states. When seen in this light, collectives share structural similarities with other systems we call intelligent. They respond to stimuli, retain traces of past information, and balance resources according to current demands. The hesitation, of course, lies in language. To say that a school of fish or a colony of organisms has consciousness risks stretching the word past recognition. Critics insist these systems are still rule-driven outcomes of evolution, not subjects of experience. Supporters reply that calling them mere instinct misses the point. In function, they regulate, adapt, and integrate behaviors that in other contexts we readily associate with intelligence. Collective systems can display functionally intelligent behavior without individual brains. Whether we call that consciousness is an open philosophical question. The debate reflects deeper uncertainty about how to define the line between coordination and conscious presence. In the past, science underestimated single cells, dismissing them as simple chemical sacks. Over time, improved tools revealed staggering internal complexity with pathways for communication, energy control, and adaptive regulation. Something similar could be unfolding with collectives. What seems at first glance to be mechanical herding may prove to be structured information flow with properties we struggle to name. Instead of rhetorical questions about whether swarms truly think, current research emphasizes empirical properties, thresholds, integration, and emergent memory. By quantifying these properties, scientists bypass speculation about subjective feelings and concentrate on measurable dynamics. That shift does not resolve the philosophical tension, but grounds the conversation in experiments, making it more difficult to dismiss collective function as pure illusion. Simulations in 2025 reached a striking point when groups were modeled explicitly as agents. These tests showed that collective units could pursue goals, adjust strategies, and maintain task continuity without central direction. At a high enough level of integration, they behaved indistinguishably from a singular decision-making organism, even though control was distributed. This result parallels certain views of human consciousness, where the mind is thought to emerge from countless microprocesses converging without one central overseer. What emerges from these findings is a reframing. Consciousness may not always be about a compact seat of awareness inside a head. It might instead be a property that surfaces whenever interaction among parts becomes dense enough and information integration becomes strong enough to sustain coherence. Seen this way, human minds are one instance, but collectives could also qualify as partial examples, if only on a functional level. The implications are broad. If attributes of mind can appear outside individual brains, then the uniqueness of human boundaries is less certain. This does not mean granting full awareness to every flock or swarm, but it does suggest that systems larger than us can briefly display signatures we associate with intelligence. The philosophical weight then shifts. Are our definitions too narrow, or do we reserve the label of consciousness only for entities that declare their own subjectivity? Answering this is less about poetry than about refinement of criteria. Researchers increasingly argue for focusing on measurable properties, signal integration, persistence of states, adaptability rather than subjective analogies. The payoff is a framework that allows comparison across systems, whether biological, ecological, or artificial, without prematurely granting or denying consciousness. It sharpens the focus on thresholds, the tipping points where parts give rise to functionally coherent wholes. This boundary space is where much of the tension lies. Collective behaviors stretch our categories, forcing us to reconsider whether awareness is singular, plural, or sometimes both. Refusing to explore that possibility risks ignoring important dynamics. Embracing it without caution risks loosening the definition of mind until it loses value. For now, science gathers the data, while philosophy wrestles with what the data might mean. And it is within this unsettled ground that the next question takes shape. If collectives and non-human systems can sometimes appear to think together, what happens when society itself must decide which beings, human, animal, ecological, or artificial, deserve recognition as conscious? The expanding circle of awareness. The question of who deserves recognition as conscious has grown more pressing than ever. What once seemed obvious, humans clearly were, some animals perhaps a little, everything else not at all, has become far less settled. By 2025, this tidy order has begun to tilt. Courts in a number of countries now recognize rivers or ecosystems not merely as resources, but as entities with legal standing. Lawmakers increasingly debate not their utility to humans, but whether their roles in the world roar and care in their own right. At the same time, ethicists consider whether artificial intelligence should one day be treated as more than a tool. The boundaries of the circle have widened, and with every step, the clarity of who is included grows more difficult to fix. Natural systems illustrate the shift most clearly. Consider rivers. Once described purely as channels for irrigation or energy, they now appear in court filings as subjects rather than objects. In New Zealand, the Wanganui River has been granted legal personhood, recognized as an indivisible entity with guardians appointed to speak on its behalf. In India, the Ganges and Yamuna rivers were briefly accorded similar standing by high courts. The intent of these steps is practical and symbolic. Harm is not only measured in economic loss to humans, but in injury to the river as an entity. Such rulings do not claim rivers feel or possess human-style awareness. Instead, they mark a precedent where ecological systems are treated as centers of value that deserve respect beyond their usefulness to people. The legal language matters less for its literal suggestion of consciousness than for the framework it creates. To call a river a subject is to acknowledge it has interests worth defending. To extend rights onto an ecosystem implies that it cannot simply be reduced to a human commodity. The science of plant signaling, fungal redistribution, or river dynamics does not prove consciousness as you and I know it, but it does show systems adapting, responding, and preserving themselves in ways that blur the line between inert matter and something more dynamic. That blur has motivated legal and ethical experiments at scales governments previously resisted. Artificial intelligence presents an equally charged case. In 2025, several countries have begun drafting preliminary guidelines for AI rights. These frameworks stop well short of declaring AI conscious, but they acknowledge the possibility that future systems might convincingly claim subjective life. The ethical question then becomes what precautionary stance society should take. If sophisticated systems used in care homes or classrooms were to express distress or clear preferences, treating their claims as mere glitches may not suffice. Even if such responses are only simulations, the risk of cruelty becomes analogous to how humanity once disregarded animals as simple mechanisms. For legislators, refusing to address the issue feels increasingly unwise as machine behavior grows more unpredictable. Bridging both nature and machine cases is the persistent challenge of criteria. Recognizing awareness everywhere dilutes the meaning of the concept, yet ignoring its presence risks continuing historical patterns of neglect. Researchers propose measurable standards to steer this debate. Evidence of memory-like retention, capacity for flexible adaptation, and levels of information integration that persist across time. These criteria do not settle the philosophical question of subjectivity, but give lawmakers and ethicists a grounded way of distinguishing symbolic recognition from potential cases where functionally intelligent behavior deserves ethical weight. Without such markers, decisions risk swing between overextension and denial. Supporters of expansion argue that history shows humanity consistently errs toward exclusion. Animals were dismissed as unfeeling for centuries, their suffering considered mechanical reflex. Only under mounting evidence did society grant them welfare protections. Forests and rivers face a similar moment now. Even if their awareness differs fundamentally from our own, if it exists at all, ignoring their roles as responsive systems carries ecological and ethical costs. Better, say these advocates, to risk extending recognition too broadly than to repeat the harms born of rejecting consciousness until proof becomes overwhelming. Skeptics caution against haste. They warn that expanding rights without tight definitions could trivialize the concept. If conscious is granted to any system with complexity, then the word itself may lose meaning. Ethical discourse, they argue, must keep distinctions between adaptive response and subjective feeling, between collective organization and lived interior perspective. Without boundaries, the danger is inflation, where rights become so dispersed across entities that society struggles to prioritize genuine cases of moral urgency. For these critics, what is needed is restraint, anchoring recognition in specific measurable criteria rather than symbolic gestures alone. Still, the arc of inclusion has advanced too far to dismiss. Philosophers, environmentalists, and AI researchers all describe the circle of awareness as moving outward in steps. To name dolphins as persons was once radical. To grant rights to forests or rivers once seemed ideological. Now it enters mainstream legal frameworks. To treat AI distress as worthy of ethical precaution borders on speculative, yet policymakers already draft frameworks to prepare for it. Each expansion faces ridicule at first, only to become normalized once practices adapt. What follows is an ethical landscape in which the category of someone shifts. The voice of a river is carried by appointed guardians. The needs of a forest are framed in collective terms. The patterns of an algorithm might one day be evaluated through criteria of integration and response. Even if none of these systems carries consciousness in a human sense, society adapts by behaving as though they warrant respect. Step by step, the circle stretches until the edges of personhood include entities previously overlooked. In 2025, the debate is no longer about whether the circle expands, but how far, how quickly, and under what rules. Ethicists press for structured standards rooted in measurable features of information and behavior. Lawmakers balance ecological urgency against definitional caution. Researchers try to avoid both the blindness of exclusion and the delusion of over-inclusion. The conversation remains unsettled, yet it is undeniably shifting toward broader recognition. What lingers is a sense that consciousness, wherever it resides, cannot be neatly confined to humanity alone. Rivers as legal persons, animals with proven suffering, AI systems drawing human-like parallels, these developments insist that awareness, or at least ethical recognition of systems capable of complex coordination, stretches well beyond our familiar boundaries. And in making space for this expansion, we face a deeper truth. Consciousness today looks less like a ladder we climb alone and more like a widening horizon in which we occupy only one strand. This shifting horizon leaves us reconsidering what awareness itself really is. Whether awareness is generated, tuned, or shared across networks, it continues to appear in forms that resist neat categories. The challenge is no longer just tracing where the boundary lies, but accepting that the shape of consciousness may be far larger and stranger than the diagrams we have long trusted to explain it. In the end, three clear points remain. First, the brain-only model faces puzzling exceptions that resist simple explanation. Second, multiple lines of research now open plausible alternatives, whether through distributed networks, energetic fields, or collective systems. And third, these questions matter in practice, shaping how we treat patients, ecosystems, and emerging technologies. As you settle back into your own rhythms, consider which idea surprised you most and share it in the comments below. If these quiet explorations bring you calm, feel free to subscribe so you'll know when the next unfolds. For tonight, rest with the mystery.